I hope you enjoyed learning about the brain and these three main parts and observing the brain the other day. The cerebrum for thinking, personality, and planning. It's really what's distinctive in humans. It's so big and wired so complexly that we're able to do such remarkable things and feats of logical thinking and intelligence that other animals maybe can't do. The cerebellum at the back of the brain for posture, balance, and coordination, and the brainstem, which does all those involuntary things for survival that we don't want to have to worry about. It connects our uh, brain to our spine, to the nerves, to the rest of the body. You might ask, though, how do we know so much about the brain? Well, it is a newer science, and we're learning all the time. We haven't known everything that we know now. Some of the stuff we've learned is pretty new. But one of the ways that we learn things about the brain is through accidents. Not so good for the person it's happening to, but we do learn from it. So here is a very famous historical story. It's in our book. If you've been looking around, it's there. It's the story of Phineas Gage. And we're coming up on the anniversary of his accident, September 13th, 1848. He was a railroad worker in the 1800s, just kind of a young guy in his early 20s, about 23, but he was really good at his job, good at planning, good at running a crew, and so that's what he did. And people called him a really, really nice guy, really good guy, also a hard worker. Unfortunately, on a certain day, there was an accident. See, one of the jobs that railroad workers have to do is blow explosives through rock to make way for the railroad. So they take these, what are called tamping irons, to be able to put stuff like blasting powder and dynamite into the rocks. And so they have to make these holes and tamp these rods into the rock. Unfortunately, there was an explosion one day, and Phineas was standing nearby, and this small end of the tamping iron went underneath his left cheek and then out the top of his head. It knocked him down, but he got up afterward, remarkably enough. But the rod went all the way through his head and flew out behind him. And they actually have this on display somewhere today. But it flew out behind him, and he got up and was able to talk and everything. And they drove him to a physician after that. And he didn't die. He lived for about 11 to 12 years afterward. So this is an important case study in history because he actually survived this accident. He had part of his brain damaged. So with the case study, you look at how was the person before the accident versus how are they after. Did they lose certain skills? If they lose certain skills or have certain personality attributes change, then you can infer that that was the part of the brain that controlled those things. If you want to hear maybe a better account of the story, you can listen to Hank Green's explanation. He does the SciShow on YouTube. Type in SciShow and Phineas Gage, or go to this address here, and you can hear probably a better account than I can give. Hank is pretty good at explaining things. All right, so this is what his skull actually looks like after this happens. After he died, they actually took his skull. It's still at a museum somewhere. They still have it. And you can see where his skull was damaged. So then you can infer that underneath those parts of the skull, that's where the brain was damaged as well. And it did damage his left eye also. Pretty sad. So we've done many models and studies of this. So look at the part of the brain that was damaged. It's definitely the cerebrum part. So let me put this picture up. It's the frontal lobe part of the cerebrum. Look at the way it kind of juts out forward. So this is what's behind your forehead. And this is also what's very distinguishing about human brains is this big, huge frontal lobe. If you look at a chimpanzee brain, it's kind of curved backward. It doesn't have this big frontal lobe. We say the frontal lobe directs logic and personality and planning. And we can kind of show that with Phineas Gage's accident. After his accident, Phineas was no longer Phineas, they said. He could no longer plan for the future very well. Thoughts became kind of erratic when trying to do that. He wasn't a nice guy anymore. He became kind of lewd and crude. And in fact, it became very hard to work around people. So he went and started working at a stable to work around horses, which makes sense because if you say something bad, you're not going to insult the horse, I guess. So he couldn't be a foreman anymore. So we can infer then that because of what was damaged and the skills that he lost, that was the part of the brain that controlled that. So it's that frontal lobe that got damaged, that distinguishing part of the human brain. Well, he did go on to other things than just work at a stable. He worked at a circus for a while and probably made some money recounting his story and showing his injuries and showing his tamping iron. He did that for a while. And when he did die, he started going into convulsions and seizures before his death. And they did keep his skull. And you might wonder, how in the world did he survive this in the first place? I mean, come on, part of his brain was damaged. In fact, when they took him to the physician, they even recount that part of, like the mush from the damaged part of the brain fell out, like a couple teacups full or something like that. How did he survive that? Well, I guess you can also infer that part of the frontal lobe, then, if it's damaged, perhaps maybe for survival, we don't completely need all of the frontal lobe. Survival stuff must be controlled more in the inner parts of the brain and the brainstem. Physically, why he didn't perish, they think that the skull acted kind of like a trap door as the rod passed through. That it snapped open, it didn't quite blow off, and then snapped shut, which probably helped seal things up a little bit and maybe control some of the blood loss a little bit. So, but you can definitely see the damage on his skull there, and you can see the healing that took place in the last 11 or 12 years of his life. Very unfortunate for Phineas, but we did learn something from it. You may notice when you look at the brain that it's divided into two halves. There's a right and a left hemisphere. One of the neat things about that is that the left hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. And then vice versa, the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. They say that the left hemisphere controls more things like math, logic, and language, while the right hemisphere is kind of more of your artsy side and spatial skills. Maybe if you can parallel park a car really well, maybe your right hemisphere is working great. I need work on my right hemisphere. A lot of people ask questions when they're doing tasks. Am I more of a right brain person or more of a left brain person? And why are there lefties and righties? Well, you can look that up on the SciShow, and they have little episodes on that kind of stuff. And the addresses are down here, or just type in SciShow with those topics and you'd be able to find it. Also a reminder, our brain stem does those involuntary functions and evolved long ago. It's a regular part of the brain that many animals share. Again, they don't all share the big cerebrum and the frontal lobe. So this one evolved long ago and is shared by most animals, though not all animals have that, like jellyfish and sponges do not. But that's another story. Did you know that if the brainstem is not damaged, you can actually stay alive? So here's another example of learning from more accidents. It's a lot of interesting stuff with the brain. So let's go back to 1945, September 10th. Well, wouldn't you know it, I'm actually recording this video on September 10th. So this is an anniversary here for Mike the Headless Wonder Chicken. So Mike's parents were some farmers, and of course, they raised chickens and they butchered chickens for food. Well, this farmer here in the picture, when he cut the head off the chicken, he kind of missed a little bit. He, as you can see, cut most of the head off, but he left a significant part of the brainstem behind. And he noticed that the chicken didn't die. In fact, it started getting up and walking, which is kind of common. Chickens, when they have their heads cut off, I grew up on a farm, so I know this, they kind of flop around a little bit for a while if you let them, before the blood drains out and then they bleed to death. But this chicken was actually walking around and he was kind of amused and decided to just let it go and see how long the chicken would do that. Well, as a fluke of nature, the blood must have clotted and Mike did not bleed out and actually survived his ordeal. And there he is. In fact, he would walk around the farmyard and he would actually act like he was pecking on the ground, despite the fact that he didn't have a face to pick up seeds. And they took him on the road and made money. Not a lot of money. He said he made enough to maybe get some extra machinery for his farm, but they made some money. Well, one of the things that Mike is missing is his ability to kind of cough up mucus, which is an important thing that we do. If your trachea meets with your esophagus, you continually have mucus coming up and you just swallow that. Well, that wasn't very easy for Mike, having lost what he lost. So they would every day have to take a syringe and suction that mucus out so that he wouldn't choke to death. One day on the road, they forgot his syringe and he actually choked and ended up dying after about 18 months living without a head. Kind of a sad story. But they still celebrate this in Fruita, Colorado. This is the great-great-grandson of those farmers. And you can see this statue here if you ever go there. Interesting. But what did we learn? Well, we learned that the brainstem does these involuntary functions for us and keeps us alive, even though our cerebrum and part of our cerebellum might be missing. Again, it's another one of those accidents that taught us something. Nowadays, we have other ways of seeing what's going on in the brain. We don't have to wait for someone to die and dissect the brain. We don't have to wait for accidents to happen. We have technology. We have the ability to do MRI scans like we see here, magnetic resonance imaging. So this might actually show a tumor in the brain here. We have CAT scans and PET scans, that stands for positron emission tomography. Basically, these types of scans show where you're burning sugar or glucose in your brain when you're doing a task. So for instance, they might have you write something or sing something or do a math problem, and whatever part lights up, that's the part of the brain that you're using to do those tasks. Pretty cool stuff. Your brain is so important. It controls so many things, your bodily functions, your personality, especially because of that big frontal lobe we have in the cerebrum, your intelligence, your creativity, your emotions, your memory, your movement, and your senses. We could spend years studying the brain, but we don't have that amount of time. Here's a famous individual who supposedly didn't have a brain. The brain is said to be plastic. It can change. As you grow up, it changes. Well, that's because of the brain cells. Let's take a look at what a brain cell looks like. Looks like this. One brain cell is called a neuron, sometimes also called a nerve cell, but in the brain they're called neurons. And it consists of all these branches with a main cell body, and then kind of a conduit that goes downward and then ends in more branches. It reminds me of electricity, like this, and it's made to transmit electrical impulses and actually chemical impulses as well. So structure determines function. It's made for what it does. So looking at a neuron, the dendrites are these branchy things on the end. So those are what receive a signal. Then this is the main cell body that has a nucleus, just like we're kind of used to with other cells. Then this conduit that goes down from the cell body is called the axon, and this is generally covered in fat, which acts like insulation. And these other cells that surround it called Schwann cells. So the message goes from the dendrites down the cell body and then down the axon, and then ends at the bottom here at these axon branches. All right. One of the weird things about this is that the neurons don't touch each other. By the way, you have 10 to the 12th neurons. They don't touch each other. You have so many of them, and they don't even touch each other in the brain. There's a space between each one. That space is called a synapse. So you've got this electrical signal moving down a neuron, and then it gets to the end. So how does that signal travel to the next neuron? Well, the answer is that it turns into a chemical signal. It excites these little vesicles at the end of those axon branches, which then release their chemicals into this space in between. So those chemicals are called neurotransmitters. And then when those chemicals reach the membrane of the other side of the neuron, it's what would be a dendrite of the next neuron, it turns that signal electrical again so that it's able to travel down that next neuron. Very quick response. It sounds like it would take forever for something like this to travel, but it's kind of like lightning. It's split second fast. Even from, like, think about how you don't even have to think. You move a finger and you don't even have to think about doing it. It's so fast. Here's another picture of what that might look like. There. In fact, it's pretty fast, but when you have to go from your foot or your toes all the way up to your brain, that actually takes a little more time, I guess, than if you're going from your shoulder to your brain. That's a little less time. But let's look at this guy here. This is a remarkable picture because this guy wearing red actually is getting his leg broken by getting entangled in this guy's legs. But it's at the split second before the message has been transmitted to his brain. It's your brain that makes you feel pain. So that message is on its way up to his brain, and he has not received it yet. So it's like a split second timing, awesome picture. Not so awesome for the guy in red, but awesome to look at least for us. Now there are things that are faster than those neurons. They're called reflexes. The purpose of these are to protect you. This is when you need to go faster than regular neuron speed. So basically in a reflex, the message travels to the spinal column. And then the spinal column kind of realize that, hey, this is a very intense message, and it bypasses the brain and sends the response back to the body part so that you can do what you got to do. And then the brain is notified last. So these are actually things taken care of by the spinal cord instead. They're called reflexes or reflex arcs. So one example might be touching a hot stove. That's a pretty intense signal. And when that signal reaches the spinal cord, it quickly bypasses the brain and sends a message back to your hand to pull it away, like jerk it away really quick. And then you realize, whoa, I just touched a hot stove. If I'd have left it on there longer and waited for my brain to react, you would have had more damage than quickly jerking your hand off the stove and then maybe getting it under some cold water to stop the damage and stop the burning. Sitting on a tack might be something else. If you, I don't know how many of us have ever sat on a tack or touched something really sharp and we jerk our hand away. That could be another example. Or somebody throwing a punch at your face, you flinch. That's a pretty intense message that your spinal cord makes you flinch like that and close your eyes and move your head to protect it. Or a fly, which I've had a fly around me here, a fly flying at your eye, you flinch. Those are all reflexes, and they help to at least reduce the damage by kind of leaving the brain out of the decision and the spinal cord much more automatic and getting that reaction much more quickly. See, there's so many neat things about the brain, right? All right, here's some really cool pictures. This is what a brain looks like during surgery. So you see the brain has its own blood supply. About 25% of your blood is in the brain at any given time. They actually wake you up for brain surgery. They might put you to sleep for a while they cut in there, but then they wake you up, and if they had to say like cut out or treat a brain tumor or something like that, they would be poking around and asking you to do things like speak words or move a finger because they don't want to cut out a part or treat a part of your brain that does an important function for your body. Here's a guy actually playing guitar while they're doing brain surgery. That's pretty neat. Oop, that's a disgusting picture of a brain there. But I guess I like that kind of stuff. Here's a brain tumor there, doing some brain tumor surgery on a 38-year-old patient. This is the guy who has Einstein's brains. I don't know, how did he get so lucky to have Einstein's brains? Einstein was a very intelligent man in a kind of a different way than many of us are intelligent, just kind of out of the ordinary. And they wanted to know, what is it that made his brain so different? And you can look it up, and they found he had a certain type of matter in his brain, which was much more than some of the rest of us have. Or how about this? Anybody ever had a tapeworm? Ah, a tapeworm is a long worm, can reach like 60 to 90 feet long. You can pick it up by eating undercooked meat. That's one way to get it. Tapeworms generally in other animals will live in the intestines, but sometimes they burrow out, especially if they get into the wrong animal. Like a human is the wrong animal. So they might burrow out because they're unhappy, or it's part of their life cycle to do so. And then they end up in places they're not supposed to end up, like in body parts and muscles. They can be kind of painful. They can also end up in the brain, like this person here, whose brain was dissected, and they have all these little tapeworm cysts. Those tapeworms kind of set up home in the brain, and then they create this cyst of material that protects them around them. And obviously that's not good for the brain at all. Here's your brain when you were in embryo. Oh, looks kind of cool. All right, some other things. A lot of people always ask, there's this myth out there, do I really use only 10% of my brain? Actually, that's not true. Not true at all. Watch the SciShow clip on that if you have questions about it. All right, there's some important parts of the brain that we'll hear about maybe a bunch this year. And if you take other biology electives later on next year or when you're a senior, you might hear about these parts. And even in health class, you'll hear about these parts. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. All right, the hypothalamus is sometimes what we call the master gland. It works with both kind of the nervous system and the endocrine system. It releases about 12 hormones of its own that control the pituitary and also control other things in the body. Very important things. In fact, the hypothalamus is always kind of monitoring your blood to make sure that levels of things are good, what they should be, helping you maintain a balance or what we call homeostasis. The pituitary gland, right up next to the hypothalamus, receives some of those signals to get activated from the hypothalamus and then releases some that help you regulate growth, like you've heard of puberty before, and also metabolism. So where are these located? Well, they're kind of right behind the bridge of your nose. See the hypothalamus, this big area here, kind of connection to both nervous and endocrine system. And then the pituitary gland is a little bulb right below it, which is pretty much strictly endocrine system. So sometimes the pituitary is called the master gland of the endocrine system, but the hypothalamus is the master gland of both the endocrine and the nervous system. So here's another zoomed out picture of that. So the hypothalamus, this area right here, and then the pituitary right there. So we'll hear about these two structures, these glands, probably quite a bit this year because of the fact of what they control and what they do and how they regulate our different functions of our body. Senses. The brain controls our senses. All right, so here's our 5 main senses: taste, hearing, smell, vision, and touch. So this is kind of cool. If you look on the plastic model of the human brain I have in the classroom, you'll be able to see these also. These are called olfactory bulbs, and these help to control smell. The amount of cells in there isn't quite as much as in, say, a dog, who has much better smell and sense of smell than we do. But ours isn't too bad. So that's what this is right here sticking out underneath. Those are the olfactory bulbs. Here's that the blue part in front. That's that frontal lobe that was damaged in Phineas. Go to the back of the brain. I love this word, occipital. It's kind of a fun word to say. The occipital lobe way in the back regulates sight, which is kind of funny because your eyes are up front, but the occipital lobe that processes sight is way in the back. So look at it this way. The message comes in the eyes, travels the optic nerve, which goes all the way to the back of the brain. The temporal lobe, this side area here, controls hearing. And this purple part is called the parietal lobe, where our sense of touch is controlled. The brain, which is part of the nervous system, is divided into 2 main regions. Of course, there's the brain and the spine. the midsection, so they call that the central nervous system. It's like the controller of all. And then that branches out into your limbs and other parts of the body, and so that's called the peripheral nervous system, which kind of means to the side. And again, it's kind of like electricity. So all in all, the brain is so interesting. I get so excited talking about the brain. There's so many questions, but not enough time to go over all of it. But some of the main stuff and some interesting stories like the Phineas Gage story and Mike the Headless Wonder Chicken story and Einstein's brain. So there's some really cool drama that's historical and brain related. So I hope you enjoyed that and maybe learned a little bit more about the brain, and also make sure you know these three main parts, the cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem, and what they do. Be able to recognize the frontal lobe and discuss a little bit how it's distinguished in humans, how it's so big and so well developed in humans, controlling logic and personality. Know that the brain is divided into two halves, the right and left. I guess that's not too hard there. They control opposite sides of the body, which is kind of odd, but kind of cool at the same time. Know our main glands that do a lot of controlling of bodily functions, like the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So make sure you can recognize those. And also be able to recognize a dendrite, or excuse me, a neuron with its dendrites and cell body, axon and axon branches. There they are. So if I give you this picture, you would know, oh, that's a neuron. And then if I asked you which direction the signal would travel, you could tell me that it travels from the dendrites and cell body down the axon and to the axon branches. And the fact that they don't touch other neurons, that there's a synapse or a gap between them. And in order to keep a message going, we have to use chemicals called neurotransmitters in order to do that. That reflexes are for survival and helping reduce damage, and are a little bit faster than what the brain does because it's controlled more by the spinal cord. All right, make sure if you have any questions, you let me know. And we have a test coming up really soon.